So just when you thought that data breaches were at an all-time high, Microsoft might have just quietly fixed the biggest of them all. That's right. Because of a recently fixed vulnerability in Azure Cosmos' database, Jupyter Notebook feature, thousands of Microsoft customers have had their entire databases, all their data, private keys, potentially sitting exposed for several years. I don't know what's been going on at Microsoft for the last couple of years, but they have had some serious vulnerabilities. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. You tell me. We're finding the vulnerabilities and fixing them, but is that a bad sign? So today, we're going to take a look at this vulnerability, who's been impacted, who discovered that vulnerability, and what you can do about the broader issue of supply chain and vendor risk. But before we get there, I need you to hit that like button and maybe go ahead and leak the subscribe button while you're down there. So while the move to the cloud has enabled companies to innovate faster, provide better services, grow faster using cheaper technology, not have to supply hardware, it has also led to some pretty large breaches over the last few years. This is especially visible with Amazon storage buckets that we've seen leaked. For example, 2017, Booz Allen Hamilton leaked battlefield imagery, spy archives, all kinds of sensitive data in improperly configured storage buckets. 2017, the US voter record data leak, where 198 million US American voter information was leaked in buckets that were improperly configured by a company doing research for one of the political parties. Again, in 2017, we saw the leak at Verizon Wireless. 6 million customer records, IT system configuration information, even login credentials that were stored in these online databases that were improperly configured were left exposed and potentially leaked. And maybe one of the worst leaks in the cloud that we saw up until that point was the Pentagon leaks in 2017 as well. 3 separate leaks of misconfigured databases online, leaking spy information, contractor information, sensitive information about ongoing operations, and all kinds of data that should not have been publicly seen. And while all of those were very bad, Microsoft's recent blunder might have outdone them all. Ars Technica even called it the worst possible cloud vulnerability that you can actually have. So Cosmos is one of a myriad of services and products that Azure offers. As you know, Azure is Microsoft's cloud infrastructure platform, much like AWS, Google Cloud, where you can rent space for servers, hardware, workspaces, remote desktops, SIEMs, security monitoring, all kinds of tools that they have available. Cosmos is their cloud database. Per Microsoft, Azure Cosmos Database is a fully managed NoSQL database used for modern app development. Microsoft guarantees single-digit millisecond response times, 99.999% availability, backed by their SLAs that they sign, automatic instant scalability, open source APIs for MongoDB and Cassandra integration. So, as you can see, a very promising product for organizations using databases. But the actual vulnerability was with the Jupyter project. Jupyter is an open source project. It's a notebook. It's used for data visualization in databases and large data sets. Data scientists can use it to visualize the data that they're trying to analyze. Microsoft promoted it for that use, to visualize data. And all of that actually brings us to the vulnerability that was discovered by Wiz Security. Wiz Security is an Israeli company specializing in cloud cybersecurity. They have several products for cloud security monitoring. They've discovered dozens of vulnerability in cloud infrastructure, Amazon, Google Cloud, and even Azure in the past. Microsoft added functionality for the open source Jupyter Notebook project in 2019. Customers using Azure Cosmos could add Jupyter Notebooks to visualize their data. Microsoft promoted it as a very user-friendly to visualize the data in those databases. And they even went so far as in February of 2021, they began enabling Jupyter functionality by default for Azure Cosmos users, so that when someone signed up for Azure Cosmos, the Jupyter functionality was enabled by default. If it was not used within a certain amount of time, it was then disabled. Contributes to part of this vulnerability. What Wiz found was this privilege escalation exploit that allowed them to elevate their privileges because of a vulnerability in that Jupyter functionality. They could elevate their privileges so that they could get the private keys, get root access to any other Azure Cosmos database user's database. And Azure Cosmos has some pretty big customers. Coca-Cola, JetBlue, Liberty Mutual, and thousands of other large customers. In fact, 3,000 customers is the number that Microsoft gives on their website of people using Cosmos database and Jupyter functionality. They say that only a third of those users were affected because of the being turned off after default. However, there's still a risk that we'll get to here in a second. As Wiz pointed out, this vulnerability, because of this privilege escalation, pretty much leads to game over from an attacker's perspective. Because they could get private keys of other customers, they could add themselves as root users, read that data, delete that data, edit that data without them even being notified or knowing. Now, Microsoft did do a pretty good job resolving this vulnerability. Within 48 hours of Wiz notifying them, they had identified the source of the vulnerability, resolved it, and they paid Wiz a $40,000 bounty. Microsoft has said that they don't think anyone exploited this vulnerability because their logs didn't show any evidence of anyone elevating their privileges outside of Wiz. But what that does not take into account is if someone had harvested those keys without actually elevating privileges and is saving them for later. And that could be a huge issue because Microsoft is not forcing people to change their keys. They are suggesting strongly that everyone who has used Cosmos since Jupyter was enabled or has Jupyter enabled now go and recycle their keys. But if someone does not change their keys proactively, and it is the case that an attacker, a nation state, harvested those keys in the past and is sitting on them waiting for the right opportunity, they could come back in a later time and access those accounts and that data. And all of that brings us to the big question that we've been discussing for the last year or so. What do we do about vendor risk? The move to the cloud, SaaS, software as a service, platform, infrastructure as a service has increased our reliance on our partners more than ever before in our history of technology. We are storing our data on other people's servers and entrusting them to look after security. And while we can do risk assessments, vendor risk questionnaires, due diligence to be sure that we're choosing good vendors, what happens when a vendor like Microsoft, who is one of the most reputed, makes such a huge mistake? That's a topic that a lot of security professionals are looking into, talking about right now, and it's actually too big to dissect in this video. So be sure that you subscribe down below so that you're notified because we have a video coming on that very soon.